The plant that's in flower up here is actually one that is still in use as a medicinal plant, and it's a Native American plant. It's called snake root, and it was used to treat female problems. And it's sometimes called squaw root as well, because the American Indian women used it. And it's still being used. It's called black cohash is another one of its names. You may have heard of it or perhaps seen a medication made from it. So it's a plant whose history of use is still supported and trusted today by a lot of people. At the back of the garden, the tall plant with the flower buds on it up there is one called Joe Pye weed, and it's a form of eupatorium. We have 2 eupatoriums growing in here. The Joe Pye weed that will, in a matter of a few days or a week or so, it's going to have some big purple flowers where those bud clusters are. And then its close relative right here is another eupatorium, and this is called common boneset. It's a plant that's really easy to recognize because the stem appears to grow right through the center of the leaf, and that's unique to this particular plant. It will have a cluster when its flower buds open. It will have a big cluster of white flowers on the top, and it likes, both of these like to grow in sunny, damp meadows, common plants. And these plants were highly regarded. In fact, this one, in addition to being called boneset, and it wasn't used to set broken bones, but there was a type of fever called break bone fever. It was a fever people would get, and you'd have aching joints when you got it. Many people think break bone fever was a historic name for dengue fever, which you may have heard of, we still talk about today. But aching joints were part of it, so it was called break bone fever. And boneset and thoroughwort were both used to treat fevers. And one reason was that if you made a tea out of the leaves of these plants and took it as a medication, you would break out in a sweat. And the idea was that people had observed that if you had a high fever, when the fever was ready to break, the patient would often break out in a sweat. So they felt if you could speed up that sweating process, then you could break the fever. And so this plant was used. But it was considered to be such a wonderful herb that it was also called thoroughwort. Wort being an old Anglo-Saxon word for herb, like the soapwort. Thoroughwort was a plant that was believed to be good for almost anything, and so it was very highly regarded. This one, that's in flower right here, is a European plant. Like the soapwort, it has escaped from cultivation, and we can find it growing as a wild plant all over the place. And this is St. John's wort, and St. John's herb. And this plant was used to make salves and ointments for cuts and wounds. One of the interesting things about those particular female problems, Mrs. Child talks about it in her book, The Family Nurse, which is where I take the title from my program. This was published in Boston. Lydia Mariah Child was a writer, and she lived in Boston, and this was published first in 1837, and it's a kind of home medicine book, and she writes in here about a wide variety of different plants that people could use for all kinds. I don't know if I'll put my hands right on her description of motherwort, which we can look at where she talks about it being effective for the problems faced by those women approaching 50 years of age. And the interesting thing is that those particular difficulties, and it was all the different things, it was nervous disorders, mood swings, all those kinds of things, were lumped together at the time under the general heading of hysteria. Today we think of somebody being hysterical, being out of their mind, but traditionally that was the kind of menopausal menstrual disorders, and it comes from the same root as hysterectomy. Hyster is the womb. So hysteria was difficulties and problems associated with the womb. Today it has a slightly different meaning.
What about that?
Yeah. Okay, let's take a look down here.